Thelvan had 6 eyes, and every single one of them was tired. He had been sitting in the deep archives of Axis Primara for 11 straight hours, surrounded by floating data screens that cast pale blue light across his gray, wrinkled skin. His species, the Chirathi, were known across the galaxy for two things: their patience and their memory. Both of these qualities made them perfect archivists and terrible company at dinner parties. Thelvan did not mind. He preferred the company of numbers. Axis Primara was the center of everything, a station the size of a small moon, built at the galaxy's core by the combined effort of over 4,000 species. It served as the seat of the galactic concord, the great alliance that had kept peace between the stars for longer than most civilizations had existed. Billions of beings lived and worked here. Diplomats argued, traders haggled, soldiers drilled, and deep below all of that noise in the quiet levels where the air smelled of old metal and recycled atmosphere, archivists like Thelvan kept the records. Every war, every treaty, every trade route, every species that had risen, and every species that had fallen. It was all here, stored in crystalline data cores that stretched for kilometers in every direction, the collected memory of a galaxy. And tonight, Thelvan had found something wrong in it. It had started as a simple audit. The Strategic Inference Council, the Concord's military analysis division, had asked the archives to compile a routine report on uncontacted worlds in the Orion Arm. The Orion Arm was a quiet, unremarkable stretch of the galaxy, far from the major trade lanes, sparsely populated and generally considered uninteresting. A few hundred primitive species lived there, still stuck on their home planets, still burning dead plants for energy or splitting atoms in clumsy, dangerous ways. The Concord monitored them from a distance and left them alone, as policy dictated. You did not contact a species until it developed faster-than-light travel on its own. That was the rule. Thelvan had been cross-referencing the uncontacted species list with military activity logs, a boring job but one that needed doing, when he noticed the anomaly. It was a planet called Earth, third world from a small yellow star, population of several billion, last surveyed approximately 400 years ago. Classification, Category 2, pre-interstellar. Low threat. The file was thin, almost dismissive. A note at the bottom read, inhabitants are carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, moderately intelligent, prone to internal conflict, no strategic value. That was all normal. What was not normal was the pattern Thelvan found when he started pulling threads. He had been looking at fleet deployment records, specifically fleets that had been sent to the Orion Arm and never returned. This was not entirely unusual. Space was dangerous. Ships were lost to navigation errors, engine failures, cosmic storms, and occasionally to each other. But when Thelvan filtered the data by destination and cross-referenced it against the timeline, a shape emerged from the noise that made 2 of his 6 eyes blink in sequence, which for a Chirathi was the equivalent of a human's jaw dropping. 14 fleets, 14 separate military forces, was sent by 14 different species across a span of 1,200 galactic standard years. All of them had traveled to the same region of space. All of them had the same target, and not a single one had ever reported back. The planet Earth. Thelvan checked the data 3 times. Then he checked it a 4th time, because he was Chirathi, and that was what Chirathi did. The result did not change. The first disappearance was the Yolhari expansion fleet, sent 1,100 years ago. The Yolhari were a large insectoid species that expanded their territory by conquering primitive worlds and using the inhabitants as labor. They had sent 30 warships to Earth. None returned. The official record listed the fleet as lost to unknown navigational hazard. The second was the Seth Dominion Strike Force, 800 years ago. The Seth were reptilian, cold, and efficient. They had sent 50 ships. The record said, fleet recalled, records sealed by Dominion authority. But Thelvan dug deeper and found that the fleet had never actually been recalled. It had simply vanished. The Seth had sealed the records to avoid embarrassment. The third was a Draven hegemony subjugation armada, 120 warships, sent 300 years ago. The Draven were one of the most powerful military species in the Concord. Their file said lost to void anomaly. Thelvan had seen void anomalies. They left wreckage, radiation signatures, gravitational scars. This one had left nothing. And so it went. 14 entries, 14 species, 14 fleets ranging from small raiding parties to full invasion armadas. The species were different. Crew 1, the time periods were different. The attack strategies, as far as Thelvan could reconstruct them, were different. Some came to conquer. Some came to harvest resources. Some came simply because Earth was there, and they were the kind of species that took what they wanted. The only thing all 14 had in common was the destination, and the silence that followed. Thelvan sat back in his chair and stared at the data floating before him. His old hearts, he had 3, were beating faster than they had in decades. He understood what the Concorde had been asking about Earth all these years. The same question it asked about every quiet, primitive world. Why haven't they made contact yet? It was a reasonable question. Most species, once they developed sufficient technology, reached out to the stars. They sent signals. They built probes. They made themselves known. Earth had not done any of these things as far as the Concorde's long-range sensors could detect. So the question sat in the file, unanswered and unimportant, gathering dust. But it was the wrong question. The right question, the one that should have been asked centuries ago, was much simpler and much more frightening. Why does no one come back? Thelvan gathered his data, organized it into a presentation that even an idiot could understand. He had worked with politicians long enough to know this was necessary, and requested an emergency audience with the Strategic Inference Council. The council chambers were impressive in the way that all things built by committee were impressive, large, expensive, and somewhat lacking in soul. A circular room with tiered seating for the representatives of the Concorde's major military powers. It was lit by a soft, golden glow that was designed to promote calm, rational discussion. It rarely worked. Thelvan stood in the center of the room, small and gray and very old, and presented his findings to some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Their reaction was about what he expected. Navigation hazards, said Counselor Mivek of the Tesserine, waving one of her 4 delicate hands dismissively. She was a slender being, almost translucent, and she had the attention span of a fruit fly. The Orion arm is poorly mapped. Ships get lost. 14 times? Thelvan asked. Over 1,200 years. Space is very large, Mivek said, as if she were explaining this to a child. For internal mutinies, offered Counselor Breathen, a squat, rock-like being from the Gorvathi mining clans. Long voyages breed discontent. Crews turn on their commanders. Happens all the time. In 14 separate fleets, from 14 separate species, each with different military structures, different crew compositions, different command hierarchies? Thelvan kept his voice level. Kirathi were not known for their emotional outbursts, but he was closer to one than he had been in 50 years. Perhaps a plague, suggested another counselor, some unknown pathogen in that region of space. A pathogen that affects insectoids, reptilians, silicon-based life forms, and gas breathers equally? Thelvan said. That would be quite a remarkable disease. What exactly are you suggesting, Archivist? This was a new voice, deeper than the others and carrying the weight of authority. Fleet Commander Orath of the Draven hegemony leaned forward in his seat. He was massive, even by Draven standards, nearly 3 meters tall, with dark scales skin, a broad jaw, and eyes like chips of yellow glass. His military decorations covered his chest like armor. Thelvan looked up at him. I am suggesting, Commander, that we have been feeding our people to something for over 1,000 years and have not noticed because no one thought to look at the pattern. The room went quiet. That is a serious accusation, Orath said slowly. It is not an accusation. It is arithmetic. Thelvan pulled up the data again, letting it float in the center of the room where everyone could see it. 14 fleets, 0 returns, 0 distress signals. 0 debris fields detected by long-range sensors. 0 survivors. The only variable that remains constant across all 14 incidents is the destination, a small blue planet in the Orion arm that we have classified as primitive and harmless. Earth is a Category 2 world, Mivek protested. They were burning fossil fuels the last time we surveyed them. The last time we surveyed them was 400 years ago, Thelvan said. And I would note that we have not surveyed them since because every ship we send in that direction tends to disappear. Another silence. This one was longer. Orith's expression had changed. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Thelvan had done his research on the Draven commander before this meeting. Well, he knew about the hegemony's lost armada. 120 warships, thousands of Draven soldiers, sent to Earth 3 centuries ago to establish a military outpost. The hegemony had quietly erased the mission from its public records. Orath would have been a young officer at the time. He would have known people on those ships. "What are you proposing?" Orath asked, and his voice was carefully controlled. "I am proposing that we find out what happened," Thelvan said. "Not with a fleet, not with soldiers, with a probe, unmanned, stealthed, expendable. We send it to the Sol system, we let it observe, and we see what it sees. If I am wrong and this is all coincidence and bad luck, then we have wasted a small amount of resources on a scientific survey. If I am right," he let the sentence hang. "If you are right," "Much what?" Mivek asked. Thelvan's 4 upper eyes looked at her, while his 2 lower eyes stayed fixed on the data. It was a Kirathi expression that roughly translated to, "You know exactly what, and I should not have to say it." "If I am right," he said quietly, "then we need to know. Because whatever is on that planet, whatever has been swallowing our fleets for 1,200 years, it is still there, and we are still sending ships to the Orion Arm." The vote was not unanimous. Mivek voted against it, because she voted against everything that required effort. Brethan abstained because the Gurvathi did not involve themselves in things that did not involve mining. But enough of the council saw the logic, or felt the fear, to approve the mission. One probe, one small machine, a packed with the best sensors and stealth technology the Conquered could build. It would travel to the Sol system, observe from a safe distance, and report back. Thelvan watched the authorization go through and felt no satisfaction. Only a deepening sense of unease that had settled into his bones like the cold of deep space. As the council members filed out, Orath lingered. He stood by the door, his massive frame blocking the light from the corridor, and looked back at Thelvan with those yellow glass eyes. "Archivist," he said, "Commander, my people sent 120 ships to that planet. Good ships, good soldiers, the best we had at the time." Orath's jaw tightened. "I was 23 standard years old. My father's brother commanded the flagship. I watched the fleet depart from orbit above our homeworld. I remember thinking how beautiful they looked, all those lights against the dark." Thelvan said nothing. There was nothing to say. "When they did not return, our leaders told us it was a void anomaly, a natural disaster, unavoidable. We held memorial services. We mourned. We moved on." Orath paused. "You are telling me that was a lie." "I am telling you that the explanation does not fit the evidence," Thelvan said carefully. "What actually happened to your fleet, I do not know. That is why we are sending the probe." Orath stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked out of the chamber without another word. Thelvan remained in the empty room for a while after that, surrounded by the ghosts of his data. 14 fleets, thousands of ships, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of living beings. All gone, all silent. And on a small blue planet at the edge of the Orion Arm, something waited. Something that had been there for over 1,000 years, quietly swallowing everything the galaxy threw at it. He thought about the survey note in Earth's file. Inhabitants are moderately intelligent, prone to internal conflict, no strategic value. He had been an archivist for over 200 years. He had cataloged the rise and fall of empires. He had recorded wars that burned across entire star systems. He had documented species that could crack planets, that could eat suns, that could fold space itself. And in all that time, nothing in the archives had frightened him as much as that little blue planet in its long, long silence. The probe launched 3 days later from a Concord military station on the edge of mapped space. It was small, no larger than a Kirathi ground vehicle, and it carried no weapons, no crew, and no identifying markings. Just sensors, a stealth generator, and a communication array designed to send compressed data bursts across thousands of light years. Thelvan watched it go from his office in the deep archives, tracking its signature on a private screen he had set up among his data cores. The probe would take 6 standard months to reach the Sol system, traveling through empty space along a route carefully chosen to avoid any known hazards or trade lanes. 6 months of waiting, 6 months of wondering. Thelvan turned back to his records. He had more research to do. He wanted to know everything about the 14 species that had sent fleets to Earth. He wanted to know what they had sent, how they had sent it, and what they had expected to find when they arrived. He had a feeling, deep in his old Chirathi bones, that when the probe finally reached Earth and showed them what was there, the galaxy was going to wish it had asked the right question a very long time ago. But wishes, as Thelvan knew better than most, did not change the data. And the data said that something was very, very wrong. 6 months passed slowly when you were waiting for the universe to confirm your worst fears. Thelvan spent those months the way he spent most of his time, buried in the archives, pulling at threads, building a picture from fragments. He had requested and received access to the classified military records of 9 of the 14 species that had sent fleets to Earth. And the other 5 species no longer existed. 3 had gone extinct from unrelated causes, 1 had been absorbed into the Seth Dominion, and 1 had simply vanished from the galactic record about 200 years ago, which Thelvan found deeply troubling for reasons he could not quite put into words. The records painted a picture that was both consistent and confusing. Every fleet had approached the Sol system with confidence. Every fleet had been composed of capable, well-armed ships with experienced crews, and every fleet had entered the system and then gone quiet. No battle reports, no distress calls, no final transmissions, screaming warnings to the rest of the galaxy. Just silence. Thelvan had begun keeping a private journal of his thoughts, a habit he had not indulged in since he was a young student. Why, he wrote in it late at night, when the archives were empty, and the only sound was the hum of the data cores. "The silence is the part I cannot explain," he wrote one evening. "If these fleets were destroyed, there should be evidence of destruction. Explosions produce energy signatures. Debris produces mass readings. Dying ships produce distress signals. It is automatic, built into the hardware of every spacefaring civilization I have ever studied. You would have to physically destroy the communication array to prevent it, and you would have to do so before the crew could trigger it manually. This means whatever happened to these fleets happened very quickly and very completely." He paused, his writing tool hovering above the page. "Or," he added, "the fleets were not destroyed at all. And that possibility frightens me more than the first." The probe's first data burst arrived on a Tuesday. Thelvan did not know it was a Tuesday because the Concorde used a different calendar system, but it was a Tuesday on Earth, and that seemed like it would matter later. The data came in compressed and encrypted, transmitted across the vast distance between Sol and Axis Primara in a tight beam pulse that took the communication array nearly an hour to decompress and decode. Thelvan was the first to see it. He had arranged this with the communications department through a combination of official authority and unofficial bribery, specifically a bottle of Chirathi archive wine that was older than most civilizations. How the communications officer had been happy to route the data to Thelvan's private terminal before sending it up the chain to the council. He opened the file. For a long time, he did not move. The probe had entered the Sol system from above, approaching from a direction perpendicular to the flat plane where the planets orbited, which was the standard approach for covert observation. It had been wrapped in the best stealth technology the Concorde could produce, a multi-layered field that bent light, absorbed radiation, and masked every energy signature the probe produced. In theory, it was invisible to any detection system known to the Concorde. The probe had started its survey from the outer edges of the system and worked its way inward, cataloging everything it found. And what it found did not match anything in the Concorde's files. And the first thing the probe detected was infrastructure. Not the primitive, scattered kind you would expect from a Category 2 civilization. A few satellites, maybe an orbital station or two. This was dense, layered, and sophisticated. Thousands of objects in orbit around the third planet, stations of various sizes, from small relay points to massive structures that dwarfed anything the Concorde's member species had built in orbit. Shipyards, actual shipyards with vessels in various stages of construction, some of them larger than Concorde battlecruisers. And around the moon, Earth's single natural satellite, a structure that made Thelvan's breath catch in his throat. A ring, an incomplete ring, still under construction, but clearly designed to encircle the entire moon. The probe's sensors could not determine its exact purpose, but the energy readings coming off the completed sections were enormous. Whatever it was, it consumed more power than most Concorde homeworlds. Thelvan stared at the images. His mind, trained by 2 centuries of archival work to process information calmly and methodically, was struggling. Earth was not a Category 2 civilization. It was not pre-interstellar. It was not primitive. The probe's analysis algorithms had attempted to assign a new category based on the observed technology level. The result came with a confidence warning. The algorithms had not been designed to handle a jump of this magnitude, but the estimate was clear. Category 6. Minimum. For context, the most advanced species in the Concorde, the Tesserine, with their delicate hands and their ancient culture, were Category 7. The Concorde as a whole, pooling the resources and technology of 4,000 species, was a Category 8. Earth, alone, with a single species, had reached Category 6, and that was the conservative estimate. The second data burst arrived 4 hours after the first. This one contained weapons analysis. The probe had detected military installations throughout the system, defense platforms orbiting Earth and Mars, and several of the larger moons of the outer planets. It had analyzed their energy signatures and attempted to match them against the Concorde's comprehensive database of known weapons technologies. It found no matches. The weapon systems on Earth's defense platforms operated on principles that the probe's analysis software could not identify. Yet the energy output was clear. These were weapons capable of significant destructive power, but the method by which they generated and directed that energy was unknown. Not outdated, not primitive, not a variation on a known technology. Unknown, new. Something that had never been seen before in the recorded history of the galaxy. Thelvan read the analysis 3 times. The probe's software, unable to classify the weapons, had done the only thing it could. It had flagged them as anomalous and recommended immediate review by Concorde weapons scientists. The third data burst was the one that broke him. The probe, continuing its inward survey, had passed through the asteroid belt, the ring of rocky debris between the 4th and 5th planets. Here, among the drifting rocks and ice, it had found something that was not natural. Ships. The remains of ships, hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows, floating in the vacuum like exhibits in a museum. They had been stripped, every piece of useful technology removed with surgical precision, every weapon taken, every engine component extracted. What remained were the hulls, the skeletons, the bones of warships that had once crossed the stars. The probe had scanned them and matched their construction signatures against the Concorde's records. The results came back one by one, each one a name that Thelvan recognized from his research. Yolhari, the insectoid expansion fleet, lost 1,100 years ago. Their ships were here, stripped and hollow, arranged in a row. Seth Dominion, the reptilian strike force, lost 800 years ago. Their vessels sat beside the Yolhari ships, equally gutted, equally preserved. Draven Hegemony, 120 warships, including the flagship that Orath's uncle had commanded. They were all here, every single one, and there were more. Ships from species Thelvan recognized and ships from species he did not. The probe counted and cataloged them all. 14 distinct groups of vessels, corresponding to 14 lost fleets, spanning 1,200 years of galactic history. They were all here. They had all been here, the entire time. Not destroyed, not scattered across space. Collected, organized, preserved, like trophies, like a warning. Thelvan sat in his chair and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It took him several moments to identify the emotion, because it had been so many years since he had experienced it. It was fear. He forced himself to continue reading. And there was one more data burst, and it was the shortest. The probe's final transmission before it went dark. The probe had continued its approach toward Earth, scanning and recording. Everything had been going according to plan. The stealth systems were functioning perfectly. There was no indication that any of the human infrastructure had detected its presence. And then, at a distance of approximately 400 million kilometers from Earth, something had scanned the probe. Not passively, not with a general sensor sweep of the kind any civilization might use to monitor its local space. This was an active, targeted, focused scan directed specifically at the probe. Something had looked at it, studied it, analyzed its stealth field, penetrated its shielding, and read its internal systems like a child reading a picture book. The probe's software had recorded the scan in detail. It lasted 0.003 seconds. In that time, whatever had scanned the probe had mapped its entire physical structure, identified its origin point, decoded its communication protocols, and, based on subtle changes in the probe's own telemetry, made small adjustments to the probe's systems that improved their efficiency by approximately 12%. It had not only detected the probe through the best stealth technology in the galaxy, it had read the probe's own hardware and software and made it work better, casually, in 0.003 of a second, and then it had done nothing. The probe was not destroyed. It was not disabled. It was not captured. It was allowed to continue its mission. It continued scanning, continued recording, continued transmitting data back to Axis Primara. It was allowed to see everything. That was the part that frightened Thelvan the most. Not the ships in the asteroid belt, not the unknown weapons, not the impossible technology. The fact that the humans had detected the probe and chosen to let it continue. They wanted the Concord to see this. They wanted the galaxy to know. Thelvan sat alone in his office and thought about what that meant. A species that hides its advancement for over 1,000 years does not accidentally reveal itself. If the humans were allowing the Concord's probe to observe them, it was because they had decided it was time to be observed. The question was why, and the answer to that question depended entirely on what kind of species the humans were. He transmitted the data to the Strategic Inference Council and requested an immediate emergency session. Then he sat in the cold light of his data screens and waited. The council session was unlike anything Thelvan had experienced in his long career. He had seen these beings argue, bicker, posture, and threaten. He had never seen them afraid. They were afraid now. The data played on the central display, each revelation landing like a physical blow. The orbital infrastructure, the shipyards, the moon ring, the weapon systems that defied classification, and finally the wreckage museum in the asteroid belt. Every lost fleet, cataloged and displayed like specimens in a collection. No one spoke during the presentation. No one interrupted with theories about navigation hazards or crew mutinies. The data was too clear, too complete, too damning for comfortable denial. When the final image faded, the probe's telemetry showing the moment it was scanned, the 0.003 of a second contact that had seen through every piece of conquered, stealth technology like it was not there, the room was silent. Fleet Commander Orath broke the silence. His voice was quiet, which was far more unsettling than if he had been shouting. "Show me the Draven ships again." Thelvan brought up the images. 120 Draven warships, floating in neat formation in the asteroid belt, stripped of every useful component. Hulls intact but empty, 300 years old and perfectly preserved in the vacuum of space. Orath stared at the images. His yellow eyes moved from ship to ship, and Thelvan could see the muscles in his jaw working beneath his dark scales. The old archivist wondered if Orath could identify individual vessels. If he was looking for the flagship, if he was looking for the ship his uncle had commanded on a mission that was supposed to be routine. The subjugation of a primitive world that should have taken a few days at most. "They did not destroy them," Orath said finally. "They took them apart. They learned from them." "Yes," Thelvan said, "every fleet that attacked them, every piece of technology those fleets carried. Weapons, shields, engines, navigation systems, communication equipment. Yes, they took all of it. They studied it. They reverse engineered it. They improved upon it." Orath's voice was still quiet, but something in it had changed. Every fleet we sent made them stronger. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Counselor Mivak, who had so confidently dismissed Thelvan's concerns 6 months ago, looked like she was going to be sick. "This cannot be correct," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "A Category 2 species cannot advance to Category 6 in 1,200 years. It is not possible." "It is not possible through natural development," Thelvan agreed, "but they did not develop naturally. They were given a gift. 14 gifts, in fact. 14 packages of advanced alien technology delivered directly to their doorstep by species who intended to conquer them. Each time they were attacked, they gained access to new science, new engineering, new principles. They did not have to discover these things on their own. They only had to be clever enough to understand what they had been given. And survive the delivery," Orath added grimly. "Yes, and survive the delivery." The discussion that followed went on for hours. It went in circles, as discussions among frightened politicians always do. Some counselors demanded more data. Some demanded that the information be classified at the highest level. Some demanded that fleets be assembled immediately. But underneath all the noise, one truth sat at the center of the room like a stone, and no amount of talking could move it. For 1,200 years, the galaxy had looked at Earth and seen a quiet, primitive, harmless little world. It had sent its predators, its conquerors, its raiders, and Earth had swallowed them all. Not just survived them, consumed them, learned from them, grown from them. Every attack had been a lesson. Every invasion had been a gift. And the humans had been patient enough, smart enough, and determined enough to turn each one into a stepping stone. And now, after 1,000 years of silence, they had allowed the Concord to see what they had become. Thelvan left the council session late that night, walking through the empty corridors of Axis Primara with slow, heavy steps. His old bones ached, and his 6 eyes were more tired than ever. Behind him, the council was still arguing. They would argue for days, perhaps weeks. That was what they did. But Thelvan was done arguing. He had seen the data. He had done the math. And the math told a story that was simple and terrible. The galaxy had created something. Through 1,200 years of aggression, through 14 acts of unprovoked violence against a species that had done nothing to deserve it, the galaxy had created the very thing it should have feared most. Not a primitive world, not a quiet backwater, a civilization that had been forged in fire, tempered by war, and armed with the combined technology of every species that had tried to destroy it. And the worst part, the part that kept Thelvan awake that night and many nights after, was that he could not blame them, not even a little. If the galaxy had wanted peace with Earth, it should have offered peace. Instead, it had offered war, 14 times, and Earth had learned. The news spread through the galactic concord the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, uneven, and impossible to control. Despite the Council's attempts to classify the probe's findings at the highest level of secrecy, the information leaked within days. It always did. 4,000 species, millions of officials, billions of data terminals. Secrets did not last long in a civilization that large. Within a week, every major species in the Concord knew about Earth. Within 2 weeks, it was all anyone talked about. The reaction was not calm. On the Draven homeworld, the revelation that 120 warships had been swallowed by a planet the hegemony had dismissed as primitive triggered a political earthquake. The ruling military council faced questions it had avoided for 3 centuries. Families who had mourned soldiers lost to a void anomaly now learned that their loved ones had been killed by a species the hegemony had tried to enslave. Protests erupted in the capital. Statues of the admirals who had ordered the mission were torn down. The Seth Dominion reacted with characteristic coldness. They had always known their strike force had not been lost to accident. Their intelligence services had suspected the truth for centuries. But suspecting and confirming were different things, and the confirmation sent a chill through even their reptilian blood. The Seth began quietly reinforcing their border defenses along the Orion Arm, saying nothing publicly, but making their actions visible enough that everyone noticed. The Tesserine, who prided themselves on their sophistication and cultural superiority, reacted with something close to panic. They had never sent a fleet to Earth. They were not a military species, But the idea that a single civilization had achieved Category 6 status, while the Tesserine were still comfortably at Category 7, was deeply unsettling. The gap was smaller than it should have been. And unlike the Tesserine, who had taken 40,000 years to reach their current level, the humans had done it in 1200. Smaller species reacted in smaller ways. Some were frightened, some were fascinated. A few, particularly those who had suffered under the conquest of larger powers, felt something unexpected: admiration. Here was a species that had been attacked by the strong and had refused to die. There was something appealing about that, especially if you were small and had spent your history being pushed around by the big. On Axis Primara, the Council fractured into factions almost immediately. The first and loudest faction was led by Fleet Commander Orith. Despite his personal horror at the fate of his people's armada, or perhaps because of it, Orith had come to a conclusion that was shaped by a lifetime of military thinking. Earth was a threat. It was the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. Every year that passed, the humans grew stronger, and every year the advantage of numbers that the Concord currently held grew smaller. If the Concord was going to act, it needed to act now, while it still could. "They are predators," Wrath argued in the council chambers, his deep voice carrying the weight of conviction. "They have been watching us, learning from us. Every fleet we sent, they used to advance. They did not reach out for peace. They did not reveal themselves. They sat in their system and they harvested our technology and our people. That is not the behavior of a peaceful species. That is the behavior of a species that is preparing for something." The second faction, smaller but more thoughtful, rallied around Thelvan. The old archivist had become an unlikely political figure, a quiet Shirathi record-keeper who suddenly found himself at the center of the greatest crisis in galactic history. He did not enjoy it, but he understood the stakes too well to step aside. If the humans wanted to attack the galaxy, Thelvan argued, they could have done so centuries ago. They have had superior technology for hundreds of years. They have had weapons we cannot identify, defenses we cannot penetrate, and the element of surprise. If they were preparing for conquest, they would have come by now. They have not come. They have stayed in their system. They have built their civilization, and when our probe arrived, they did not destroy it. They let it see everything. Because they wanted to frighten us, Orath countered. Perhaps. Or perhaps they wanted to be known. There is a difference between a threat and an introduction. The third faction wanted neither war nor peace. They wanted distance. Led by several of the mid-tier species who had no desire to be caught between the Concord's military might and Earth's unknown capabilities, they proposed a simple solution: quarantine. Seal off the Orion Arm. Declare it a restricted zone. Do not attack Earth. Do not contact Earth. And do not allow anyone to enter Earth's region of space. Build a wall of silence and let the humans stay behind it. Thelvan thought this was the most foolish option of all. You could not contain a species that had already demonstrated the ability to strip and reverse engineer the technology of every civilization it encountered. A quarantine wall was just another gift waiting to be delivered. While the galaxy argued about what to do about Earth, no one on the council thought to ask the most basic question of all. What did the humans think about all of this? No one asked because no one could. There was no communication channel to Earth, no diplomatic frequency, no envoy, no ambassador, no point of contact. For 1,200 years, the only messages the galaxy had sent to Earth had come in the form of warships, and the only reply had been silence. But the humans were not silent. They were watching, and they had been watching for a very, very long time. Admiral Kaid Marin stood on the observation deck of the warship Lesson Remembered and looked out at the wreckage museum. She was 63 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair cut short and gray at the temples. Her face was weathered in the way that faces get when they spend too much time carrying the weight of responsibility. She had been the commander of the Sol Defense Compact for 11 years, which meant that for 11 years, she had been the person responsible for protecting the human species from a galaxy that had tried to kill it 14 times. It was not a job that encouraged smiling. The Lesson Remembered was parked at the edge of the museum, the field of alien wreckage in the asteroid belt that humanity maintained as a memorial and a reminder. Through the observation deck's broad windows, Marin could see the hulls of ships from species she knew by name, species she had studied her entire career. Yulhari troop transports, Seth Dominion gunships, Draven dreadnoughts with their distinctive angular hulls, and others, older still, from species whose names the humans had learned only after cracking their language databases from the captured ship's computers. Every ship out there represented a species that had looked at Earth and seen something to be consumed: food, labor, resources, territory. Not one of them had come in peace. Not one had sent a message before sending weapons. Marin had grown up with this knowledge. Every human had. It was taught in schools, discussed in homes, and engraved into the foundations of human civilization so deeply that it could never be forgotten. The galaxy is not your friend. The galaxy does not know you. The galaxy sees you as prey. It had not always been this way. Marin thought about the early days, the ones she knew from history books and archive recordings. 1,100 years ago, humanity had been young, fragile. They had barely left their home planet. Small colonies on Mars and Europa, research stations on the Moon, a handful of deep space probes crawling toward the outer planets. They had looked up at the stars with wonder and hope, dreaming of the civilizations that might be out there, imagining the friendships they might form, the knowledge they might share. The Yulhari had cured them of that. The first attack had come without warning. 30 Yulhari warships had appeared at the edge of the Sol system and advanced on Earth with the casual confidence of a predator approaching a wounded animal. And the Yulhari had not bothered to communicate. They had not made demands. They had simply begun their approach, weapons hot, troop transports ready. Humanity had nearly died that day. The war that followed lasted 3 years and cost millions of lives. The humans had nothing that could match the Yulhari technology. Their weapons were laughably primitive by comparison. Their ships were slow, fragile, and few. But they had something the Yulhari had not expected: a willingness to sacrifice that bordered on insanity, and a capacity for creative violence that the insectoid invaders had never encountered. Humans rammed their ships into Yulhari vessels. They turned mining equipment into weapons. They reprogrammed navigation satellites to crash into enemy formation at orbital speeds. They fought with improvised explosives, jury-rigged railguns, and a fury born of absolute desperation. And slowly, painfully, at a cost that left scars on the species that would never fully heal, they won. When it was over, the Yulhari fleet was destroyed. Not a single alien ship escaped the system, and humanity stood among the wreckage and understood, with a clarity that changed them forever, what kind of galaxy they lived in. They did not waste time with grief. They got to work. The reverse engineering began immediately. Every piece of Yulhari technology was recovered, cataloged, analyzed, and understood. Faster than light communication, energy shielding, weapon systems that made humanity's nuclear arsenals look like firecrackers. Material science that was centuries beyond anything human engineers had imagined. It was all there, scattered across the solar system in the wreckage of 30 alien warships, waiting to be learned. And humans were very, very good at learning. Within 50 years, humanity had leapt forward by what should have been 5 centuries of natural development. They rebuilt their fleet with hybrid technology. Human ingenuity married to Yulhari science. They fortified the solar system. They expanded their colonies. And they waited. The Seth Dominion came 300 years later. They were stronger than the Yulhari, more organized, more disciplined. They sent 50 ships. It was not enough. Humanity defeated them in 4 months instead of 3 years, and the captured Seth technology pushed human advancement forward another great leap. New propulsion systems, new energy generation methods, new computational architectures that made human computers 1,000 times more powerful. After the Seth, humanity began to understand the pattern. They were not going to be left alone. The galaxy would keep sending its predators, and each predator would be a test. The only question was whether humanity could keep passing. So they stopped hoping for peace and started planning for survival. They built the Sol Defense Compact, a unified military command with authority over every human settlement in the system. They constructed defense platforms around every planet and major moon. They developed weapons based on principles they had learned from captured alien technology, then improved on them, then improved on the improvements. They became very good at war, not because they loved it, but because the alternative was extinction. And they made a decision that shaped everything that followed. They would not reveal themselves. The logic was simple and cold. Every species that had come to Earth had come because they saw a weak, primitive world that could be easily conquered. If Earth revealed its true capabilities, two things would happen. First, the galaxy would stop sending small fleets and start sending large ones. And second, Earth would lose the one advantage that had saved it every time: surprise. So humanity hid. They kept their radio emissions low. They did not send probes beyond the Oort cloud. They did not attempt faster-than-light communication with the wider galaxy. They let the Concord surveys see what they expected to see: a quiet, unremarkable world that had not yet discovered how to leave its own system. And every time the galaxy sent another fleet to test that assumption, humanity destroyed it, stripped it for technology, and grew stronger. 1,200 years, 14 attacks, each one a lesson, each one a gift delivered by enemies who did not know they were teachers. Maren had studied every one of those engagements. She could recite the details of each battle from memory: the dates, the forces involved, the human losses, the technological gains. She carried the weight of that history the way all humans carried it, not as a burden, but as armor. Now, standing on the observation deck of the Lesson Remembered, she reviewed the latest intelligence report on her personal datapad. The Concord's probe. They had detected it immediately, of course. Human sensors had seen it before it even entered the Oort cloud. They had tracked it, analyzed it, and, on Admiral Marin's orders, allowed it to proceed. It was time. 1,100 years of hiding had served humanity well. It had given them time to grow, to build, to prepare. But hiding forever was not possible, and more importantly, it was not desirable. Humanity had not built its civilization in a bubble because it wanted to live in one. It had done so because it had no choice. The galaxy had forced its hand. But things had changed. Humanity was no longer the fragile species that had barely survived the Yolhari. It was no longer the scrappy survivor that had fought the Seth with improvised weapons and desperate courage. It had become something else entirely, something that even Maren, who understood human capabilities better than almost anyone alive, found difficult to fully appreciate. The moon ring alone was proof of that, a megastructure encircling an entire celestial body, powered by energy systems that no other known species could replicate. It was still under construction, still years from completion, but even in its current state, it represented a level of engineering that placed humanity among the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. And the moon ring was not even their greatest achievement. That honor belonged to Project Threshold, and Project Threshold was something Maren did not discuss with anyone outside of the highest levels of the Sol Defense Compact. She put down the datapad and looked out at the wreckage museum one last time. All those ships, all those species that had come to Earth with weapons drawn and intentions clear, they were all here, preserved in the cold and the dark, a testament to the price that the galaxy had paid for its arrogance. But the museum's days were numbered. Maren could feel it. The probe had changed everything. The Concord knew about Earth now, not the Earth of its outdated surveys, but the real Earth, the one that had been growing in the dark for over a millennium. The galaxy was going to react, and it was going to react in one of two ways: with open hands or with clenched fists. Maren hoped for open hands. Every human hoped for open hands. Despite everything the galaxy had done to them, despite the attacks and the silence, and the millennia of being treated as prey, humans had never stopped wanting what they had wanted from the very beginning: to not be alone. But hope was not a strategy, and Maren had not survived 30 years in the Sol Defense Compact by relying on hope. Because she activated her command channel. "This is Admiral Maren to Threshold Command." "Threshold Command receiving, Admiral." "Begin activation sequence for Project Threshold. Authorization code Maren 77 Omega." "Confirmed. Threshold activation sequence initiated. Estimated time to full operational status, 14 days. "Understood. Maren out." She closed the channel and stood in the silence of the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, In the bright center of the galaxy, the Concorde was arguing about what to do with Earth. Politicians were making speeches. Generals were drawing up battle plans. Archivists were combing through records, trying to understand a species they had never bothered to contact. They were asking questions as they always did, the wrong questions as they always had. They asked, "What has Earth become?" They should have asked, "What did we make them?" And they should have asked it 1,000 years ago. Marin turned away from the window and walked back into the ship. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The galaxy was finally paying attention, and humanity needed to be ready for whatever came next. Behind her, the wreckage museum floated in the silence of the asteroid belt, a graveyard and a classroom, and a warning all at once. The bones of 14 fleets, stripped and preserved, and arranged with a care that was almost gentle, turning slowly in the light of a distant yellow sun. The galaxy had taught humanity to fight. It had taught them to hide. It had taught them to build, to plan, to endure. It had taught them that the universe was dangerous and that survival was not guaranteed, and that the only thing standing between a species and extinction was its own determination. But there was one thing the galaxy had not managed to teach them. Despite 1,200 years of trying, it had not taught them to hate. And that, more than the weapons or the technology or the impossible engineering feats, was what made humanity dangerous. Not because they were angry, not because they wanted revenge, but because, after everything that had been done to them, they were still capable of mercy. The galaxy just did not know it yet. The Armada was the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the Galactic Concorde. 12,000 warships from 30 different species gathered in a staging area 3 star systems away from Seoul, their combined mass so great that the local gravitational field was measurably distorted. Dreadnoughts the size of cities. Carriers packed with fighter craft like eggs in a nest. Assault ships, siege platforms, electronic warfare vessels, supply freighters, hospital ships, and command cruisers bristling with antennae and sensor arrays. The full might of organized galactic civilization brought together for a single purpose. Fleet Commander Orath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Draven Dreadnought Iron Conviction, and looked at the fleet deployment map with a feeling that he told himself was confidence. It had taken him 3 months to build this coalition. 3 months of arguments, threats, promises, and political maneuvering that had tested every skill he had developed in 40 years of military service. Where many species had refused to participate, the Tesserine had withdrawn entirely, calling the operation a catastrophic escalation that would define the Concorde's legacy for millennia. Several dozen smaller species had also declined, some out of fear and some out of a quiet sympathy for Earth that Arath found both baffling and infuriating. But enough had agreed, the Draven. He sat in the silence of his disarmed ship and let the question settle into his bones, where it would stay for the rest of his life. Behind the retreating fleet, among the 8,000 ships that had chosen to withdraw before the advance, Thelvan's earlier transmission was being received and shared. The old archivist had sent it during the day of waiting, a personal message to the Concorde Council, unofficial and unauthorized. It read, "They gave us a choice. The fleet that chose correctly is unharmed. The fleet that chose incorrectly is also unharmed. I ask you to consider what kind of species, possessing the power to destroy 12,000 warships without effort, chooses instead to simply send them home. I ask you to consider what that restraint means, and I ask you to consider whether, in their place, we would have been so kind." Among the retreating ships, in quarters that were too small and on a vessel that was not his own, Thelvan sat by a viewport and looked out at the stars. His 6 eyes were wet, which was unusual for a Kirati. They were not a species given to tears, but these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, because for the first time in 1,200 years, the galaxy had attacked Earth, and Earth had chosen to answer with mercy. And that meant there was still a chance. A small one, fragile and uncertain, but real. A chance that the next message between humanity and the galaxy would not be carried on a warship. A chance that someone finally would ask the right question, and that Earth, after all this time, would be willing to answer. Gemini, eager to avenge its lost armada, had contributed nearly 2,000 ships. The Seth Dominion, always willing to project force, had sent 1,500. The Gorvathi mining clans, persuaded by promises of access to Earth's resource-rich system, had provided their massive ore haulers refitted with weapons. And dozens of other species, motivated by fear or greed or simple herd instinct, had added their fleets to the whole. 12,000 ships. It was an absurd number. No force in galactic history had been this large. Eorath's own military analysts had calculated that even a Category 7 civilization would struggle against a fleet of this size. Earth was Category 6, perhaps a strong Category 6, but there were limits to what a single species could do against the combined weight of 30 civilizations. At least that was the theory. Thelvan was aboard the Iron Conviction as well, though not by choice. The Council had insisted that the expedition include a senior analyst, and Thelvan, as the foremost expert on Earth, was the obvious selection. The old Shirathi had protested. He had argued. He had called the operation the 15th mistake in a series of 14, which Orath had not appreciated. But in the end, he had come because he understood that if this fleet went to Sol without someone willing to counsel restraint, the outcome would be worse than it needed to be. He found Orath on the bridge, standing before the deployment map like a general from an old painting. "Commander," Thelvan said. "Archivist." Orath did not look away from the map. "We jump in 6 hours." "I know. I came to ask you a question." "I am busy." "It is a short question." Orath finally turned, his yellow eyes sharp with impatience. "Ask." When the Yolhari sent their fleet to Earth 1100 years ago, they sent 30 ships. They expected an easy conquest. They were wrong, and none of them returned. When the Seth sent their fleet 300 years later, they sent 50 ships. They also expected an easy conquest. They were also wrong, and none of them returned. Each subsequent fleet was larger than the last. Each was defeated. Well, my question is simple. What number do you believe is large enough? Orath's jaw tightened. 12,000 ships is not 30 ships, Archivist. No, it is 400 times 30 ships. But the species you are attacking today is 400 times more advanced than the species the Yolhari attacked 1100 years ago. Perhaps more. The math has not changed. You are simply using bigger numbers. The math has changed, Orath said firmly. 30 species, 30 different technologies, 30 different tactical doctrines. Even if Earth's defenses are formidable, they cannot anticipate and counter all of them simultaneously. Thelvan's 6 eyes blinked in a slow sequence that Orath had learned to recognize as deep skepticism. Mara, you are assuming that a species which has spent 12 centuries studying the technology of every civilization that attacked it has not also studied the tactics and strategies of those civilizations. I am assuming that 12,000 ships, properly coordinated, can overwhelm any single system defense. It is not a complex assumption, Archivist. It is basic military arithmetic. Basic military arithmetic is what every previous attacker relied on. They all had the numbers. They all had the confidence. They all had the assumption that a primitive, single-planet species could not possibly match their capabilities. Thelvan paused. They were all wrong. Orath turned back to the map. Your objections are noted, Archivist. They have been noted many times. The operation will proceed. Thelvan nodded slowly, and he had expected this answer. He had given it his best effort, and his best effort had not been enough. It rarely was when dealing with beings who had already decided what they wanted to believe. Then I have one request, Thelvan said. What? When we arrive at Sol, give me access to the communications array. If there is an opportunity to talk instead of fight, I want to be able to take it. Orath looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Granted, but I do not think there will be such an opportunity. Perhaps not, but I have learned in my long career that the opportunities we do not expect are often the ones that matter most. 6 hours later, the Armada jumped. The transition from normal space to faster-than-light travel was always disorienting. A brief moment where the universe seemed to hold its breath before reality reasserted itself. 12,000 ships made the jump simultaneously, a feat of coordination that required the combined processing power of every navigation computer in the fleet. It was impressive. It was also, Thelvan reflected, exactly the kind of impressive gesture that species made when they were trying to convince themselves they were not afraid. They emerged at the outer boundary of the Sol system, beyond the cloud of icy debris that marked the border of Earth's star's gravitational influence. 12,000 ships, spread across a volume of space so vast that the nearest ones were barely visible to each other, without sensors. And they found silence. Orath had expected resistance at the boundary, long-range weapons, automated defense platforms. Warning shots at the very least. His tactical officers had prepared detailed response plans for a dozen different scenarios, all of which assumed some form of initial contact or confrontation. None of them had prepared for nothing. The Sol system lay before them, quiet and dark. The probe's data had shown a system bustling with activity. Orbital infrastructure, defense platforms, shipyards, the moon ring. But now sensors detected none of that. The stations appeared powered down. The defense platforms were dark. The shipyards showed no energy signatures. Even the moon ring, that massive structure that had so awed the analysts back at Axis Primara, appeared to be inactive. It was as if the entire system had been switched off. "Report," Orath ordered, keeping his voice steady. "No hostile contacts, Commander. No energy signatures consistent with weapons or shields. No active sensor emissions from any human installation. The system appears dormant." "Dormant," Orath repeated. He did not like the word. A sleeping predator was not less dangerous than an awake one. It was more dangerous because you did not know when it would open its eyes. "It is a trap," said Sub-Commander Vreth, Orath's second in command, a younger Draven with sharp features and sharper instincts. "They are drawing us in." "Agreed," Orath said. "But we did not bring 12,000 ships to sit at the doorstep. All fleets advance in formation. Standard combat spacing. Weapons ready but do not fire unless fired upon." The Armada began to move inward, a vast wave of metal and energy pushing slowly toward the heart of the Sol system. And they passed the orbits of the outer planets, gas giants with rings of ice and families of moons, all apparently uninhabited. They passed the asteroid belt, and every crew member who looked out a viewport or checked a sensor screen felt a chill as they saw the wreckage museum. Hundreds of alien ships, stripped and empty, floating in neat rows among the rocks. Orath had ordered his crew not to look at the museum. Most of them looked anyway. The sight of those Draven dreadnoughts, 3 centuries dead and perfectly preserved, had an effect on morale that no amount of commanding could prevent. These were their ships. Their people had died here, and the beings who had killed them had kept their ships like souvenirs. The Armada pushed on, past Mars, a red planet with visible signs of human habitation on its surface but no active defenses, and toward Earth itself. The blue planet grew larger on their screens, wrapped in swirls of white cloud, orbited by its single large moon and the dark, incomplete ring that encircled it. Still nothing. No defenses. No fleet rising to meet them. No weapons fire. "Commander," Thelvan said from his station at the communications array, "I do not like this." "Neither do I, Archivist. A species that has successfully defended itself against 14 invasions does not leave its home undefended. They are not dormant. They are waiting. Waiting for what? For us to get close enough to hear what they have to say." Orath was about to respond when every communication system on every ship in the Armada activated simultaneously. It was not a hack. It was not a forced intrusion. The humans did not break through the fleet's communication security. They simply spoke, and every device capable of receiving a signal received it. Personal communicators, bridge speakers, data terminals, emergency channels, entertainment systems. Even the translation devices that crew members wore in their ears to communicate across species barriers. Every single one of them carried the same message at the same time in every language known to the Concord. The voice was calm. It was measured. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and had chosen every word with care. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. But you will be the first we give a choice." A pause. The silence on 12,000 bridges was absolute. "Turn around, and we will open a dialogue as equals. Continue forward and learn why no one returns." Another pause. "You have one standard rotation to decide." The message ended. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Thelvan had ever heard. Orith stood perfectly still on the bridge of the Iron Conviction, his yellow eyes fixed on the image of Earth hanging in the center of his tactical display. Around him, his bridge crew looked at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to fear to something that, in better circumstances, might have been awe. One standard rotation, Vreth said quietly. They are giving us a day to decide. They are giving us a day to be afraid, Orath corrected. But his voice lacked its usual certainty. Commander, Thelvan said, Sheen, I would like to point out that they use the word equals, not subjects, not inferiors. Equals. That is not the language of a species that wants to destroy us. It is also not the language of a species that is afraid of us, Orath replied. They are giving us a choice because they are confident in both outcomes. They are saying, choose peace or choose war, and we will win either way. That is not an offer of equality. It is a demonstration of superiority. Or it is an offer of equality from a species that has every reason to be superior and is choosing not to be. Thelvan's voice was gentle but firm. Commander, please. We have come this far. We have seen what they can do. Give the fleet one day to consider the message. If after that day you still wish to advance, I will not argue further. Orith looked at him. The old archivist stared back with all 6 of his tired eyes, and there was something in them that Orith had not seen before. Not fear, not calculation, something simpler and more powerful. Hope. One day, Orath said, the fleet holds position. The day that followed was the longest in the history of the Concord's military. 12,000 ships sat in the darkness of space, less than an astronomical unit from Earth, and waited. Crews talked in low voices. Commanders debated in encrypted channels. Species that had been allies for centuries found themselves on opposite sides of a question that had no easy answer. When the day ended, the fleet had split. 8,000 ships, 2/3 of the armada, had decided to withdraw. Some had received direct orders from their home governments, which had been monitoring the situation and had drawn their own conclusions from the human message. Others had made the decision independently, their captains and crews choosing, for various reasons, that advancing on a species that could broadcast on every frequency in every language simultaneously was not a wise tactical decision. 4,000 ships remained, the Driven, driven by pride and the memory of their lost fleet. A significant portion of the Seth Dominion, whose commanders viewed retreat as unthinkable. Various others who were too committed, too angry, or too stubborn to turn back. Orath watched the departing ships on his tactical display and felt something crack inside his chest. 2/3 of his fleet gone, the greatest armada in galactic history, reduced by a single message to a force 1/3 its original size. He thought about turning back. He thought about it seriously for several long minutes, standing alone on his bridge while his crew waited for orders. He thought about the wreckage museum. He thought about his uncle's ship, floating empty in the asteroid belt. He thought about Thelvan's question, what number is large enough? And then he thought about the Draven soldiers who had died here 300 years ago, and the rage that had been burning quietly in his chest for months flared up and consumed whatever doubt remained. All remaining ship, he said, advance. 4,000 warships moved forward. They covered half the remaining distance to Earth before the universe changed. It happened without warning and without sound. One moment, the ships were traveling through normal space, engines burning, weapons charged, crews braced for combat. The next moment, they were somewhere else. The stars vanished. The familiar backdrop of the Sol system, the distant sun, the nearby planets, the scattered points of light that were the retreating ships, all of it disappeared. In its place was a soft, pearlescent glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a light that had no source and cast no shadows. Every ship in the advancing force was enclosed in this glow. Sensors showed nothing outside the bubble of light. Navigation systems could not determine their position. Communication arrays could not reach anyone outside. It was as if the 4,000 ships had been placed inside a soap bubble and the rest of the universe had been gently removed. Then the systems began to fail, not violently. There were no explosions, no alarms, no damage. The weapons simply stopped working. Targeting systems went dark. Energy weapons lost their charge. Missile systems reported that their payloads had been deactivated. Shields flickered and faded. Engines produced no thrust, though they continued to run. The ships had power, had life support, had gravity. Everything that kept the crews alive and comfortable continued to function perfectly. Everything that could be used to fight simply stopped. It was not an attack. It was a disarmament. On the bridge of the Iron Conviction, Orath watched his tactical display go dark, one system at a time, and felt something he had never felt in 40 years of military service. Helplessness. "Commander!" Vreth's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Weapons offline across the board. Shields inoperative. Engines are running but producing no thrust. We are stationary. Can we communicate with the rest of the fleet?" "Internal fleet communications only. Nothing gets through the... whatever this is." Orath turned to Thelvan. The old archivist was sitting calmly at his station, his 6 eyes closed, his breathing steady. He looked, Orath thought, like someone who had been expecting exactly this. "Archivist," Orath said. "What is this?" Thelvan opened his eyes. "I believe," he said quietly, "that we are learning why no one returns. They have trapped us. They have stopped us. There is a difference. We are alive. Our ships are intact. Our crews are unharmed. They have taken our weapons, not our lives." Orath opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the communication systems activated again. The same calm voice, the same measured tone. "You are unharmed, and your ships will be returned to you outside the soul boundary. Your weapons will not, and this is not a punishment. It is a boundary. You chose to cross it. We chose to hold it without bloodshed. When you are ready to talk instead of fight, we will be listening." The message ended, and then, one by one, the ships began to disappear from the bubble of light. It happened gently. A ship would shimmer, its outline blurring like a reflection in disturbed water, and then it would be gone. Sensors on the remaining ships showed nothing. No energy signature, no transit path, no indication of where the vanished ships had gone. They simply ceased to be present and became present somewhere else. Across the retreating fleet, which was now several hours into its journey away from Sol, air reports began arriving of conquered warships appearing out of nowhere in their midst. Dreven dreadnoughts, Seth cruisers, Gorvathi heavy haulers. They popped into existence like bubbles rising to the surface of a pond, each one intact, each one fully functional, and each one completely disarmed. Weapons gone, shield generators removed, targeting arrays stripped. Everything that could hurt had been taken, and everything that could not had been left untouched. The crews were bewildered. Many were frightened. Some were crying. A few were laughing with the sheer absurdity of it. They had gone to war with the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and the most dangerous species in the galaxy had responded by gently picking them up, taking away their sharp objects, and putting them back where they started. Sonor like a parent dealing with a child holding a knife. The Iron Conviction was one of the last ships to be returned. Orath stood on his bridge and watched his fleet reappear around him, one ship at a time, each one whole and helpless. His flagship had been disarmed as thoroughly as all the rest. The weapons that had taken the Draven hegemony decades to develop and build were simply gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, but removed with a precision that suggested the humans could have taken the bolts out of the hull plating if they had wanted to. Thelvan stood beside him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The demonstration had been complete. Not a single being had died. Not a single ship had been scratched. And the message was clearer than any words could have made it. We can stop you. We can stop all of you. Ooh, and we can do it without killing anyone. Orath sat down in his command chair for the first time in hours. He stared at the distant point of light that was Sol, the star that Earth orbited, the star that he had been so determined to approach with fire and fury. His hands, which had gripped the arms of his chair during hundreds of battles and thousands of drills, were shaking. He thought about the message. When you are ready to talk instead of fight, we will be listening. And for the first time in his life, Fleet Commander Orath of the Draven hegemony asked the right question. Not how do we defeat them? Not what weapons do we need? Not how many ships will it take? The right question was simpler. It was the question that should have been asked 1,200 years ago, before the Yolhari launched their fleet, Shukter, before the Seth sent their strike force, before the Draven dispatched their armada. Why did we never just talk to them? 3 months after the armada returned in silence, the galaxy was a different place. The galactic concord had not collapsed, though there were days when it felt close. The political fallout from the failed invasion was enormous, a slow-motion earthquake that cracked alliances, toppled leaders, and forced entire species to confront uncomfortable truths about who they were and what they had done. Fleet Commander Orath had been stripped of his rank. The Draven hegemony, humiliated by the disarmament of its fleet and shaken by the public revelation of its centuries-old cover-up, had recalled him to face a military tribunal. Whilst the charges were not about the failed attack, though that was embarrassing enough, but about the original sin, the decision 300 years ago to send 120 ships to conquer a planet full of people who had done nothing to deserve it, and then to lie about what happened when those ships never came home. Orath accepted the charges without protest. He stood before the tribunal in a plain uniform, without his decorations, without his rank insignia, without the armor of authority he had worn his entire adult life. And he said something that no Draven fleet commander had ever said before. We were wrong. Not wrong in tactics, not wrong in strategy, wrong in the decision to go at all, wrong in believing that strength gave us the right to take what belonged to others, and wrong for 300 years in hiding what that decision cost us. The tribunal did not know what to do with him after that. A Draven commander admitting fault was so far outside their experience that they had no procedure for it. They eventually sentenced him to a formal reprimand and permanent retirement from military service, which suited Orath fine. He was tired of war. He had been tired of it for longer than he was willing to admit. Across the Concord, similar reckonings were taking place. The Seth Dominion, which had been quietly confident in its military superiority for centuries, was forced to acknowledge that its strike force had been defeated by a species it had classified as prey. This did not go over well in a culture that valued strength above all else. Several high-ranking Seth officials resigned. Others doubled down on aggression, calling for a second, larger attack. They were outvoted, barely, by those who had watched the Armada return disarmed and unharmed and understood what that meant. The smaller species, the ones who had refused to join the Armada, the ones who had watched from the sidelines with a mixture of fear and fascination, found their voices. For the first time in conquered history, a coalition of minor species introduced a formal resolution condemning the practice of sending military forces to uncontacted worlds. The resolution named Earth specifically. It described the 14 attacks as unprovoked acts of aggression against a developing civilization and called for an immediate diplomatic mission to establish peaceful relations. The resolution passed. It was close. The Draven abstained, the Seth voted against it, and several other military powers grumbled. But it passed, and with it came a mandate. Someone had to go to Earth and talk. They chose Thelvan. The old archivist received the appointment with a mixture of pride and terror that he thought might be unique in the history of his species. He was 237 years old. He had spent his entire career in the archives, surrounded by records and data and the quiet hum of crystalline storage cores. He had never been a diplomat. He had never negotiated anything more complex than the allocation of archive shelf space. And now the Concord was asking him to be the first being in 1,200 years to speak to humanity as something other than an enemy. Why me? He asked the council. Because you were the one who found the pattern, Counselor Mivik said. And for once, she was not being dismissive. Because you were right when everyone else was wrong. And because if the humans are watching, and they are certainly watching, you are the one they are most likely to trust. You did not come with weapons. You came with questions. That is a language they might be willing to hear. Thelvan could not argue with that logic, so he did not try. The diplomatic vessel was called the Open Hand. It was a small ship, unarmed, with a hull painted in the soft white of the Concord's diplomatic service. It carried a crew of 12, all volunteers, all chosen for their calm temperaments and linguistic skills, and enough food and supplies for a 6-month mission. It did not carry weapons of any kind. It did not carry military advisors. It did not carry hidden surveillance equipment or secret communication devices for relaying intelligence back to the Concorde. Thelvan had insisted on all of this. If they were going to approach Earth with open hands, the hands had to actually be open. The journey to Seoul took 2 weeks. Thelvan spent most of that time in his small cabin, reviewing everything he had ever learned about humanity. He read the probe data again. He read the records of the 14 lost fleets. He read the analyses of human technology, human biology, human psychology. He read it all, and when he was finished, he set it aside and admitted to himself that he still did not understand them. The data told him what humans could do. It told him how they fought, how they built, how they adapted. It told him about their weapons and their defenses and their impossible engineering. But it did not tell him who they were. It did not tell him what they valued, what they feared, what they dreamed of. It did not tell him whether the mercy they had shown the Armada was a policy or a principle, whether it was a strategic decision that could be reversed or a fundamental part of their nature that would endure. He would have to find out in person. The open hand arrived at the agreed coordinates, a point in space between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, far enough from Earth to be neutral ground, but close enough to be reached easily by both parties. Thelvan stood on the small ship's bridge and watched through the viewport as the human vessel appeared. It was not what he expected. He had expected a warship. Even with all his arguments about peace and mercy and the better nature of intelligent species, he had expected the humans to show up in something sharp and angular and bristling with weapons, because that was what every other powerful species in the galaxy did when they wanted to project strength. Instead, the human ship was beautiful. It was curved where Concorde ships were angular, smooth where Concorde ships were rough. Its hull was a pale silver that caught the distant sunlight and reflected it in soft, shifting patterns. Its lines were flowing, organic, almost biological. It had no visible weapons. No sensor spines or communication towers jutted from its surface. It looked less like a ship and more like a sculpture, or a piece of music made solid. "That is a diplomatic vessel," Thelvan said quietly to his crew. They built a ship specifically for this purpose. They did not send a warship with its weapons removed. They built something new, something meant to be seen. He was right. The ship was called the First Light, and it had been designed and constructed in the 3 months since the Armada's retreat. Humanity had built it from scratch, specifically for this meeting, because they understood something that most species did not. First impressions mattered, and the shape of the vessel you arrived in said something about the conversation you intended to have. The docking procedure was simple and smooth. The open hand extended a universal docking collar, a standardized design used across the Concorde, and the First Light matched it perfectly. Of course it did. The humans had been studying Concorde technology for 12 centuries, and they probably knew the specifications of the docking collar better than the Concorde engineers who had designed it. Thelvan walked through the connecting corridor alone. He had decided this before the journey. He would go alone, as a gesture of trust and vulnerability. His crew had protested, but he had overruled them. "If the humans wanted to harm us," he said, "they could destroy this ship with a thought. My being on the bridge instead of the docking corridor would not change that. What it would change is the message. One person walking alone says, 'I trust you,' and I think they need to hear that." The airlock opened, and Thelvan stepped onto the First Light. The interior was warm. That was the first thing he noticed. Not hot, not cold, but warm in the way that a living space is warm. The kind of warmth that comes from a place being inhabited, used, cared for. The walls were a soft cream color, gently curved, with surfaces that seemed to absorb sound. There was art on the walls. Paintings, photographs, pieces of sculpture mounted in small alcoves. Thelvan recognized none of the subjects, but he recognized the impulse behind them. These were the things that the humans valued, the things they wanted visitors to see first. A man was waiting for him at the end of the corridor. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, by human standards, with brown skin that was lined and weathered, and eyes that were dark and deep and startlingly kind. His hair was gray and cut close to his head. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers, A soft jacket in a deep blue color, no uniform, no insignia, no decorations. He stood with his hands at his sides, open and visible, and when Thelvan approached, he smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, a simple contraction of facial muscles that most species in the galaxy could not even perform. But it communicated something that transcended biology and culture and the vast gap of experience between their two species. It said, "I am glad you are here." "Archivist Thelvan," the man said. His voice was warm like the ship. "My name is David Okafor Lin. I am the ambassador of the United Earth Council." Then he said something in Chirathi. It was not perfect. The pronunciation was slightly off. The tonal markers were imprecise, and he used a formal conjugation where a casual one would have been more appropriate. But it was recognizable, and it was sincere, and it meant, "Your presence honors us. We have waited a long time for this." Thelvan stared at him. In 237 years, no alien had ever spoken his language. The Chirathi were a minor species. Their language was small, obscure, studied by no one outside their own worlds. And yet this human, this representative of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, had learned it, had practiced it, had prepared it for this moment. "You speak Chirathi," Thelvan said, and was embarrassed to hear his voice waver. "Badly, I am afraid," David said, switching to Galactic Standard with an apologetic expression. "I have been practicing for 3 months, but your tonal system is extremely difficult for human vocal cords. I hope the attempt was not offensive." "It was the opposite of offensive," Thelvan said. "It was the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." David's smile widened, and he gestured for Thelvan to follow him. They walked together through the corridors of the First Light, past more art and more warmth and more evidence that this ship had been built not to intimidate, but to welcome. David talked as they walked, his voice easy and unhurried, and Thelvan listened with all 6 of his ears. They sat in a room that was clearly designed for conversation. Comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, not across a table, no barrier between them. Soft lighting, a window that looked out at the stars. A small table to the side held drinks and what appeared to be food from multiple species. When Thelvan noticed a bowl of dried kelp from his homeworld and felt his throat tighten. "We have been preparing for this meeting for a long time," David said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of an older body. "Not 3 months, not a year, centuries." "Centuries," Thelvan repeated. "We knew it would come eventually. The galaxy would notice us, or we would reach a point where hiding was no longer necessary or desirable. Either way, there would be a first conversation. We have been thinking about what to say in that conversation for hundreds of years." "And what have you decided to say?" David leaned back and looked at Thelvan with those kind, deep eyes. "The truth, which is both simpler and more complicated than you might expect." He spoke for a long time after that, and Thelvan listened. David told him about the early days, the wonder, the hope, the dream of meeting other civilizations that shared the stars. He told him about the Yolhari and the shattering of that dream and the war that almost ended humanity before it began. He told him about the decision to hide, not out of cowardice, but out of a cold, clear understanding that the galaxy saw them as prey and would continue to see them as prey until they were strong enough to be seen as something else. He told him about the centuries of building, the reverse engineering, the leaps in technology, the construction of a civilization that was designed from the ground up to survive anything the galaxy could throw at it. He described it without pride and without shame as a simple statement of fact. "This is what we did. This is why we did it. We had no choice." "We did not hide because we wanted to be alone," David said. "We hid because every time the galaxy spoke to us, it spoke with weapons. We listened to those weapons. We learned from them, but we never stopped wanting a different kind of conversation." "Then why did you not reach out?" Thelvan asked. "When you became strong enough, when you surpassed the capabilities of the species that attacked you, why did you not announce yourselves?" David was quiet for a moment. "Because we were afraid," he said, and the honesty of it was startling. "Not of you, of ourselves. We had been shaped by 1,200 years of conflict. We were very, very good at war. We were not sure we were equally good at peace. And we did not want our first act on the galactic stage to be an expression of the anger we had every right to feel. He paused, and his eyes were distant. We needed time to become the species we wanted to be, not just the species the galaxy had made us. We needed to decide who we were going to be when we finally opened the door. And we decided, after long debate, after generations of argument, after disagreements that nearly tore our civilization apart, that we were going to be kind. Not because the galaxy deserved our kindness, but because we deserved to be the kind of species that was kind. Thelvan said nothing for a long time. He sat in his comfortable chair, in a room built by a species that had every reason to hate him and his entire civilization. And he felt the weight of 1,200 years pressing down on his old shoulders. The Armada, he said finally. 4,000 warships. You could have destroyed them. Easily, David said. I without any satisfaction. But you did not. No. Project Threshold was built specifically so that we would never have to. It took us 400 years to develop, a technology capable of neutralizing any military force without taking a single life. We built it because we knew this day would come, and we wanted to have an option that was not killing. 400 years, Thelvan murmured. You spent 400 years building a weapon of mercy. David smiled at that. I have never heard it described that way. But yes, that is exactly what it is. They talked for hours. David outlined humanity's position with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. Humanity wanted to join the galactic community. They wanted to share their technology, contribute to the Concord, open trade and cultural exchange. They had no interest in conquest, no desire for revenge, no plans for empire. They wanted what they had always wanted, to not be alone. But they had conditions. They would never again be prey. They would maintain their defenses. They would hold the right to protect themselves and any species that asked for their protection. And they would not pretend that the past had not happened. The 14 attacks were history, and history could not be erased, but it could be learned from. You kept asking why we were silent, David said, leaning forward in his chair. But we were never silent. We were listening to every fleet you sent, to every species that decided we were food before we were people. We learned your languages, your science, your politics, your art, your music. We have known you for 1,000 years. When we were just waiting for you to know us as something other than a target. Thelvan felt his 6 eyes sting. You know our music? I can hum a Chirathi lullaby if you would like. Badly, of course. Everything I do in Chirathi is badly. Despite everything, despite the weight of history and the magnitude of the moment and the crushing significance of what was happening, Thelvan laughed. It was a small, wet sound because Chirathi laughter was always a little damp, but it was real. And David laughed with him, and for a moment they were not an archivist and an ambassador, not representatives of civilizations separated by a millennium of violence and silence. They were just 2 old men sitting in comfortable chairs, laughing at the absurdity of it all. The meeting lasted 6 hours. When it was over, Thelvan walked back through the docking corridor to the open hand, carrying with him more information, more understanding, and more hope than he had ever carried in his long life. David walked with him to the airlock and shook his hand, a human custom that Thelvan had read about but never experienced. It was warm, it was firm, it was a gesture that said, "We are connected now." "Archivist," David said as Thelvan turned to leave, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "All those years in the archives, all those records, all that data, all those patterns you found. What was the right question? The one everyone should have been asking from the beginning." Thelvan thought about it. He thought about the 14 fleets and the Wreckage Museum and the Armada and Project Threshold and a diplomatic ship named First Light and a man who had learned to speak Karathi because he thought it mattered. The right question, he said, was never about Earth. It was never about weapons or power or technology or threat. It was the simplest question in the universe, and no one thought to ask it. He looked at David with all 6 of his tired, wet, grateful eyes. The right question was, "Who are you?" David nodded slowly. "And now you know." "Yes," Thelvan said. "Now I know." He returned to Axis Primara 2 weeks later and presented his report to the Concord Council. The full report was extensive, hundreds of pages of analysis, transcripts, cultural observations, and strategic assessments. But the summary, and the one that would be read by every counselor and entered into the permanent record, was one sentence long. They are not what we feared. They are what we forced them to become, and despite that, they are better than we deserved. The council debated for 3 days. There were objections, reservations, conditions, and caveats. Politicians did what politicians did, but in the end, the vote came, and it was unanimous. Earth was granted full membership in the Galactic Concord. The announcement was carried across every communication network in the galaxy. 4,000 species heard it. Billions of beings learned for the first time that humanity existed, not as a rumor, not as a threat, not as a classified file in a military archive, but as a neighbor, a new voice in the galactic conversation, with a civilization that had been forged in darkness and had chosen to step into the light. On Earth, the news was received with a quietness that surprised many aliens who were watching. There were no celebrations in the streets, no victory parades, no triumphant speeches. Instead, there was something softer. Families gathered, friends embraced. Old soldiers who had spent their lives preparing for a war that never came sat in parks and gardens and looked up at the sky and allowed themselves, for the first time in 1,200 years, to feel safe. Admiral Katie Marin stood on the observation deck of the Lesson, remembered one last time, and watched as the wreckage museum was dismantled. Piece by piece, the bones of 14 fleets were carefully removed from their positions in the asteroid belt. Each hull fragment was cleaned, preserved, and prepared for transport. They were being returned, every piece to every species, accompanied by a small plaque written in the sender's own language. The translation was the same on all of them. We remember. We forgive. We are ready. Marin watched the work and thought about the generations of humans who had maintained this place, the engineers who had arranged the wreckage, the soldiers who had guarded it, the children who had been brought here on school trips to learn about what the galaxy had done to them and what they had done to survive. This place had been the heart of humanity's identity for over a millennium, a reminder that the universe was dangerous and that survival was earned, not given, and now it was being taken apart, not destroyed, returned, given back to the species that had sent it. As an act of closure and grace that Marin knew most of those species did not fully understand. Not yet, but they would. In time, they would look at those return fragments and those simple plaques, and they would understand what it meant for a species to carry 1,200 years of pain and choose to set it down. David Okafor Lynn called her that evening from the first light, which was on its way back to Earth. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Strange," she said. "Empty. Like putting down something heavy that you have been carrying for so long, you forgot what it felt like to stand up straight." Good strange or bad strange? Marin thought about it. She thought about her career, her life, the decades she had spent preparing for an attack that had finally come and been turned away without a single casualty. She thought about the wreckage museum, empty now for the first time in 1,000 years. She thought about the sky above Earth, which was the same sky it had always been, but which somehow tonight seemed wider. Good strange, she said. Definitely good strange. That night across the galaxy, beings of 4,000 species looked up at their own skies and thought about the new star in the Concord's constellation, a small blue planet orbiting a yellow sun in the quiet arm of the galaxy, a world that had been attacked, besieged, invaded, and dismissed, a world that had survived it all and emerged not as a conqueror, not as a destroyer, not as the monster that the galaxy's fears had tried to make it, but as something far more dangerous to the old ways of doing things. A world that had been given every reason to hate and had chosen, with full knowledge of what it was doing and what it was giving up, to love instead. The galaxy had spent 1,200 years asking the wrong question about Earth. The right question had been there all along, simple and patient, waiting for someone brave enough to ask it. Who are you? And Earth's answer, when it finally came, was the most human thing of all. We are your neighbors. We have been here the whole time. and we are glad at last to meet you.